Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute or two. We are still letting folks into the room. Thank you all for joining us today. We will get started in probably another minute or so, just as we allow other folks to join and come in from the lobby. You will also see, we'll go over some instructions about how to comment during this listening session. So sit tight and we will be getting to all of that very shortly. And so this meeting is being recorded. The recording has started already. So we are recorded and will eventually be posting the video, probably with this intro section trimmed, onto the NTIA YouTube page after this listening session. Alrighty, well, we can get going, and we will probably still be having a few people join us as the minutes go by. But thank you all for being very punctual to this listening session. Welcome to NTIA's listening session on ethical guidelines for research using pervasive data. My name is Emma Lanzo. I'm the Deputy Associate Administrator for Policy Analysis and Development here at NTIA, and I'll be your moderator for this session. And please note, today's session is being recorded and will be posted online at the end of the session. Next slide. So here's the basic agenda for today's session. We'll begin with a brief overview of the topic. I promise very brief, and also some housekeeping notes. But the main event really is the hearing from all of you in the listening session portion. We hope to have a great discussion, hear from everyone who has joined, possibly hear from some of you multiple times. But as we see the size of the group that we have and the number of comments that people want to share, we will go over how much time each of you should limit your remarks to. Next slide. So for some quick background on this project, NTIA has been working closely with a number of colleagues across the federal government, including most closely with Anna Lenhart at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, who has really been a leader on this issue, both before her time at the White House, and as she gets ready to depart the White House soon. So working with Anna, we pulled together an interagency working group to discuss issues of researcher access to data, and in particular, this gap that exists in ethical guidance for researchers who are using data. We call it pervasive data. You can also think of it as platform data in the course of their research. This is obviously a very hot topic these days. If you are following these issues in the European Union, DSA Article 40 deals with the issues of researcher access to data. It comes up in the United Kingdom's Online Safety Act and many other places. This has been a significant policy conversation within the United States as well. So here at NTIA, we are considering the question of whether it would be useful to draft ethical guidelines for researchers working with pervasive data. And we have launched a request for comment along those lines. In our definition, pervasive data includes text, images, biometric data, behavioral data like online purchases, and other information that makes up a person's digital footprint. You'll find a full definition of pervasive data in a footnote in the RFC. It can include data gathered from web-based monitoring, cell phones, social media platforms, search engines, AI systems, and more. It is intentionally quite a broad definition. Given that we only have a limited amount of time during today's listening session, we really would like to direct folks' attention to the request for comments. You can submit detailed written comments through the RFC, and we really encourage anybody who has something to say about this topic to consider submitting a written comment to the RFC. Next slide. So as I mentioned at the top, today's session will be recorded and posted online. That means we ask you, please do not share any private or confidential information, either your own or a third party's, here on this call today that you are not authorized to share publicly. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand to get in the queue. If you're joining through the Teams app or on the browser, you can use the raise hand function. If you are joining by phone, you can press *5 to raise and lower your hand. When it is your turn to speak, a member of our team will allow you to unmute yourself, but you will still need to actually turn on your own microphone. So right now, none of you can come off mic, your mics have not been enabled, but once your mic is enabled, as you're getting ready to speak, you will still need to hit your mute and unmute button. Again, if you're joining from the phone, you can use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. Please do try to keep your initial remarks to about 3 minutes. If we have extra time, we can open the floor up to folks who have spoken already and hear again from people. But we want to make sure that we have time to hear from everyone who would like to share some information today. We also have a team of people ready to help out if needed. If you have any technical difficulties, please send us an email if you have any issues. The email address is here on the screen. It's data, D-A-T-A, @ntia.gov, and one of our team members will respond to you as soon as we can. You see up here on the screen the dial-in information. If you run into any issues with the Teams interface, you can try dialing in. And again, it's *5 to raise your hand, *6 to unmute. We also have one of our team members, Julian, has this information as his screen for you to refer to. So if you lose track of the slide during the conversation, you can look for Julian Enriquez, and you will be able to see this information again by clicking on his name and pin for me to make it larger. All right, and with that background and housekeeping, and hopefully that gave time to for everybody to log in, we are ready to start the listening session. To kick it off, I just invite anyone who would like to offer comment on the topic of ethical guidelines for researchers who are conducting research using pervasive data to raise your hand, get in the queue. And if people are feeling shy or need a prompt, we have some questions that we can walk through, but I'd really like to start just by opening up the floor to all of you and hearing what you would like to share with us today. And so again, that's the raise hand function or *5 to raise your hand if you are on the phone. Great. See. No, thought I saw a raised hand. Maybe that was just a new person joining. All right, then, Mark, who's kindly running the slides for me, if we could go ahead 2 slides, can tee up one of the key questions, which I really hope folks on the call will have some views that they would like to share. So one of the topics that we address in our request for comment is the thorny question of consent. And as we discuss in the background section of the RFC, consent and autonomy are obviously key principles in human subjects research ethics. They are the cornerstone of how you think about conducting research on human subjects. People need to be informed about what will happen to them participating in a research process and need to give consent, especially for information about themselves, their activities, their behaviors, their thoughts, their feelings, all of that kind of thing, need to give consent before that information is collected by a researcher. Online users may be required to divulge certain personal information in the online services that they use and may not really have an ability to freely make decisions about its use. This gets tied up in questions of notice as well, but in many of the different research methodologies that people use to conduct research with pervasive data, there's not necessarily a step built in to get consent of the 20,000 people whose data you're scraping from a particular web forum or something. So I'd love to invite answers or thoughts to this question: how should researchers working with pervasive data consider questions of consent and autonomy? Please raise your hand if you'd like to weigh in on that, or if there's anything else that you would like to comment on, if this has sparked a thought in your brain. We would also be very interested in just hearing examples from your own work, from your own research processes, how you've handled issues of consent. If you think, we're also perfectly willing to hear that you think we're wildly off base with something. If you think the question of consent is obvious and easy and has been resolved already, and would like to let us know your thoughts on that, please raise a hand. Oh, great. Okay. I see Jessica Potter. Uh, yes, I've enabled your mic. You should be able to come off mute.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a kind of slightly outdated experience, but as a kind of social media, social computing researcher, um, we've actually, if we are wanting to use someone's likeness or quotes from uh, their kind of content, we've actually reached out to participants and said that your data was collected through public data using a platform API, and let us know if this is not, if you would like us to not use like your likeness or this content. And out of the 20 some odd people we reached out to, only 3 responded, and they were just like, I don't even know what you're talking about, and this seems weird, but sure, I don't know why you care about me. So we've moved away from all of that. I think a lot of my contemporaries like Casey Fiesler and Nick Preferis have also done some really interesting work in reaching out to people whose data has been collected, and just asking their thoughts on a more kind of larger survey scale of what the ethical implications of that people being their data, individuals' data being used, but them not being treated as the individual and having the protections that consent or IRB oversight might give them. So um, I think as a field, we've all just kind of moved away and obfuscate and reword and put things in likeness because of this thorny issue that like there's no consensus on from like top down or even kind of, so we've kind of created a bottom up approach that I've seen. But in the work that I've done, people don't really understand that their data is even accessible. So I think there's bigger, digital literacy, technology, tech literacy issues driving some of this that I wonder, I'm guessing is at the heart of why you guys put this question in, but just thought I would share.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And as you were kind of describing steps that researchers are currently taking to do things like obscure or modify or, in other ways transform the data or do something to data that you've collected in order to try to either provide privacy protections or account for some ethical risk to using user data without consent. It also sounds like that might cause some data quality concerns or some put some limits on the kinds of research that you could do. But does that sound right to you, or how has that experience been?
Yeah, I think that whenever you're doing like mixed method or qualitative research, you're like you always kind of have the like this kind of justification, right? Especially when you're trying to do this at like scale with like large data sets. But I think that that is a very fair assessment, especially when language matters. Like we're using specific language to pull data through the API, and then we're obfuscating that, and that that's a we're transforming that in ways that we hope is in line with what inspired the original post. But I've not yet seen a study where like they actually, understand and say what was the mental model when you posted this exact thing in your feed on this date, right? So yeah, it's that's going to be a problem until like we figure that out at a deeper level.
That's great. Thank you. Any other thoughts on these issues of consent, or if folks would like to share how you've dealt with this in your own research? Do people see any particular path forward to resolving these kinds of consent issues? I mean, that tension between what kind of consent can you get, at the time that people are signing up for an online service, and how legitimate does that consent feel versus consent at the beginning of a research study versus consent that comes after you have collected the data and you're, as Jessica was just describing, the process of reaching out to people to kind of confirm consent to have their data used, and how disorienting that can be for data subjects. Any thoughts on if there is a clear way forward on any of this? Oh, great. I see. Keep thinking I see a hand raised, but I think it is just more people in the waiting room and joining, as opposed to the hand raise. Reminder that you can raise your hand with the raise hand function or Control-Shift-K, or if you're on the phone, you can use *5 to raise your hand. Great. I see Beth.
Hi, I'm just a master's psych, so I just wanted to put that in before I made my comment. Ideally, as a consumer of social media, as well as thinking ahead, as far as researching is concerned, I think it would be really nice if there was a sponsored advertisement when we're planning to do research that would be purchased, obviously, from the social media companies that we're collecting data from, that, AI schedules to go so many times a day or whatever, as other businesses do with their advertising. And in there have a link to opt out for people that don't want their data collected. Now, of course, not everybody's going to see it, but I think those other protections that our providers have, or lack of protections that our providers provide us, probably would take care of the liability on that. But nonetheless, I really like what Jessica said about that they're confirming, because that's also giving another layer of scientific it's letting us know that it's scientifically sound. So with that protection, thank you.
No, yeah, thank you. And I think it's a really good point that one of the best ways to reach data subjects for these issues of notice and consent are, directly through the platforms that you will be conducting your research on. And it also points to the need for some amount of ability, whether it's cooperation or just a function to exist on the platform that allows that kind of outreach to happen. And that itself can get a little bit complicated. But thank you. Appreciate that. Next, we have Carrie or Kari Miller.
Thank you. Yes, it's Carrie. So I do a lot of writing AI audit criteria, and what is coming to mind for me is in a few laws around the globe, we're seeing a law for purpose limitation of data. In other words, if you put on social media that I went to a party and I did these things, the purpose of that data is to tell my friends that I did something, not for researchers to go and just dissect who I am as a person. So the purpose is limited for that data that's put out there. So if you want to use it for a different purpose, you need to come back to me and ask. And it may or may not be allowed. So just like any data subjects or any human subjects research project, you would still go through the rigors of, is it sensitive? Is it going to be harming? And then you have to get consent from the people. Yeah, I don't know how you get around that. Jessica's right. It's, people do have a visceral reaction when you come knocking on their door saying, hey, I got this data from this broker. Mind if I study you a little bit? Yeah, of course they're going to freak out. Sorry, that's just how, the world works. We've got to work harder to find our data subjects today. Thanks, Facebook, thanks.
Yes, I think, and that raises so many good points. One is that we're definitely interested in exploring more within this request for comment, the relationship of things like guidelines for researchers, ethical questions and considerations for researchers, and how they interact with existing legal obligations, right? Including legal obligations that already exist for researchers, both in the US and in other countries. But Carrie, as you're pointing out, the kind of the growing regulation of data privacy, data protection, and other kinds of regulations of online platforms are really transforming the environment for those platforms, for their users, and also for the researchers who want to use data from those services to conduct their research, right? It's a very different landscape, both in the tech, the accessibility of data, both good and bad, and the legal landscape than we saw, even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And so I think, really kind of digging into how our different existing and emerging legal frameworks shaping the experience of researchers, it's something we would certainly like to hear comments about, and kind of more thoughts and insights. And then the whole question of, what is the goal of enabling research subjects in human subjects research to give consent? And it is part of that, I think, and curious if other folks thought, is that sense of, if someone is surprised by what you were doing with their information, you're already in less than ideal circumstance. And how do you ensure that data subjects autonomy and the kind of the respect for persons that we see in the Belmont principles, for example, are really respected? And it does feel like in the mass pervasive data at scale environment, those are some of the tricky questions to get to. I think this also relates to our next slide. Mark, if you could go to the next slide. We had a discussion question also on notification. And these, notification and consent can often go together, but they also may be maybe things that you treat separately or think of separately. Would love to know if folks have thoughts about circumstances where notification alone is fine and consent is not needed, or how you think about drawing those lines. But some questions on this slide specifically around notification and those ideas and questions about under what conditions should data subjects be notified that their data is used for research, best practices for communicating with data subjects, and especially barriers to notifying data subjects. We'd really love to hear thoughts on that. And I will turn to Anya Prince. Yeah, Anya, you should be able to
hear me okay?
Yes, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks so much. So I am not a researcher. I come from this from the privacy side, and I would just say that notification is not sufficient at all, because you look at the definition of pervasive data, and a lot of the people who've spoken already are talking about people like willingly posting something online and then that being used. But your definition of pervasive data includes everything from like smart cars collecting data. And so if the notice is that you're when you buy your car, you somewhere in the fine print of the car says that this data could be used for research, it's just ridiculous. I mean, I think the larger problem is that we don't have a data privacy protections in the US. And so that's the larger problem in terms of just what can be collected from people without their knowledge or consent in general in the US. And so I think it does raise ethical questions then over whether or not we should be researching in an already, as you said, data-driven and big data-driven environment.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'm curious if do you see places where lines could be drawn, or as I think you were pointing to some of the different sources of data, and that that sense of, if you're buying a new car or a new washing machine or some other connected device, is it even within the realm of possibility that you're thinking that this will eventually be used by a researcher somewhere to, study some question about, how technology impacts society? Uh, do you see, for Anya or for anyone else on the call, do you see lines or ways of demarcating where, consent is really absolutely necessary, where mere notification might be acceptable, or do you come down on the side of it's never enough just to notify, consent should always be required? Yeah, Anya, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just, I think one of the problems is that in our data environment, even somebody who does not want to participate can't. And what I mean by that, I'll share a personal example that I've written about publicly. But I became pregnant, and since I'm a health policy or like a health privacy nerd, I tried to keep that fact from data brokers. And I was unsuccessful, even though I'm knowledgeable about that type of thing. So here's somebody who, would not want to join in any research, doesn't want that data out there, and cannot hide that data from people. And so there is no control from individuals. And I think that that's the problem. And so while I understand that a lot of good research can come from that data, there is no way for somebody to meaningfully consent to their data being collected in our society. And so that gives me pause that anybody can meaningfully consent to the research being done, even though I fully acknowledge that like 90 something percent of people would willingly participate in much of the research. I worry about the people who would not want to and have no control. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I wonder for others on the call, any thoughts on also the line of kind of identifiability versus aggregation, and how that dimension of the kind of data that is collected, the way the data is used, does that play into your thoughts about notification and consent? If you're talking about massive amounts of data that are pretty well aggregated and only reported on in the research context in a way that is very, very difficult for anybody to possibly disaggregate that information, does that change your thinking about the ethical implications of using someone's data without their notice and consent, or does it not? Because we know that aggregation is not perfect, de-identification practices are not perfect or are not guaranteed, and that there may continue to be risks to individuals, even with kind of the best efforts at providing some sort of shield for privacy of individually identifying information. Yes, Carrie, let me enable your mic and over to you.
Sure, and I'm just going to go right back to what the laws are already telling us on this front, which is when you do this in a one-on-one basis where you're going to be able to see someone's social behavior, their personal traits, if you're doing it for the purposes of tracking to see if they're going to commit a crime or, predict whatever it is they're going to do. That's where the real problems are. The aggregated stuff is less problematic, although more susceptible to bias. And then you have this whole other world of issue you have to deal with. But it's the stuff that is identifiable that you want to try to avoid, I guess, or that's what the laws are saying. And mostly for the purposes of, attempted manipulation and further decisions of those people. So if the Human Subjects Review Board can see that that's not what you're going to do, then hopefully you can get through that process. But that's really where the rubber meets the road. It's that social scoring kind of stuff that we're seeing out of China a little bit. that they're guarded against. And so that's what the laws are kind of hinging on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that that sense of kind of personal or individual consequences has come up a lot in the conversations that we've had so far, and background research that we and our colleagues have been doing, feeding into this process. It does seem to get a little murky, at least in current research and writing, when you get into the significantly aggregated kind of massive data sets and raise questions like, would, one person out of 10,000 not want their, trace data of their activity on following links on social media to be used in a research project about, the spread of mis and disinformation or something, like things where what is trying to be studied is really at the systemic level or the group level, not at the individual level, but still people may have strong feelings about being identified with a certain group or having their data go towards certain kinds of research, maybe where they disagree with the research aim or disagree with the research conclusions. So we found a lot of different sorts of angles to where individual users might have a desire not to opt out or not to opt in to having their data be part of a research study, and it seems quite complex. Would love to, excuse me, and would love to invite any other comments along those lines, or any other comments that folks have if the discussion so far has got you thinking about something else, or you had other ideas that you wanted to make sure were raised during this listening session. Please do raise your hand. Again, it is *5 to raise your hand if you are on the phone, and otherwise the raise hand feature in the Teams app. Yes, Jessica, please come on.
So I think this might be definitely is connected to some of the consent, but some of the temporality of this data, like, I might be fine with sharing this data with you at one point and then not at another. And then, just like, because a lot of the data that we're talking about is so ingrained with our patterns, our life, our environments. And those often, like if we're thinking about smart appliances and things within our homes, like the consent isn't just the individual, but it's the group of people that are within that space that are generating that data. So I think that, like, the complexities around like the temporality and then like multiple individuals contributing to those like one data sources, or that those singular data, I think are other thorny issues in an already thorny space.
Yes, it's a really good point, and reminds me of feedback and comments that we also heard while NTIA was co-chair of the Kids Online Health and Safety Task Force, and we talked with a lot of researchers about research that they were doing or wanted to do on how young people used technology, used devices, used online services, and our colleague Anna Lenhart at OSTP also organized a great roundtable as part of this process with researchers focusing on kids' data. And one point that some researchers kept making, I think, to kind of remind everyone else about the challenges of doing this research is that in a lot of families, especially lower income families, you don't have a direct one-to-one device to individual ratio. And so trying to study, a particular teenager's use of a device, if that is a device that is shared among 3 or 4 members of a family, can get really tricky, both in just getting good quality data and understanding what is the teen's use of that device, but also the implications for any kind of research methodology that involves installing software onto that device, with the teen and their parents' consent, but is it the consent for everyone else in the family who also uses that device at some point? Those kinds of issues of really understanding how are people using technology, using shared accounts, using shared devices, being surrounded by household technology in common, that it's both again a data quality issue. How do you actually know what information pertains to a particular individual, but absolutely this ethical question of whose notice and consent are you even trying to get in relation to that data? I think, Mark, we could move to the next slide. Oh, yes, I see another hand up from Robert. You should be able to unmute now, Robert.
Yes, speaking from the IRB perspective, and maybe that I'm missing some basic points I didn't pick up. I'm surprised the discussion doesn't include considerations for whether the data is prospective or retrospective, and whether the considerations around waivers related to practicability don't come into play. And am I missing something in that, or is that part of the conversation in this type of research?
I think that is absolutely part of the conversation. I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on the relevance there. I mean, prospective versus retrospective data. Obviously, what you're giving consent for changes considerably than a known quantity. But I'd love to hear kind of more thoughts there. We are intentionally taking a very broad frame on this issue mostly because we have talked with researchers who are doing just about every combination of collection of data and methodology and target user base. So we're trying to cast the net widely, but would love to hear more about the relevant distinctions that you're seeing here.
Well, I think the argument that most IRBs end up having to consider is the practicability of either consent or even notification. I mean, is it even possible? What kind of steps would have to be taken? And along with that is the discussion about what kind of risk is involved. Is it minimal risk? Is it no risk? Under what conditions? Obviously, as the risk of the study increases, and here you're talking primarily about, data security and privacy. As the risk increases, then the need for disclosure and consent obviously becomes more critical. So that's my observation.
Yeah,
of course,
absolutely. Thank you.
In those situations, then it's important for the researchers to make a case for just how practicable or not the notification or consent is, and likewise just how real are the risks related to data security and privacy.
And I'm curious if, kind of from your experience, or from the perspective of an IRB, if a researcher comes to you with a project where it both seems like the risks are potentially quite high, but it would be very impractical to obtain consent, how do you think through that? So I feel like that's the sort of situation we may face a lot with this notion of pervasive data, the data from online platforms, data from other sources that are generated by people's interaction with online services and with technology. As other commenters have been sharing, there's so potentially so much data there, potentially very sensitive or personal information, or information generated from very sensitive or personal activities, and also maybe some really big barriers to getting in contact with the users whose data it is, or explaining the nature of the research or obtaining consent. And so I'm curious how from the IRB perspective you kind of resolve an issue like that, where it does seem like the risk is high, but also the practicability of doing notice and consent is quite low.
And those are great questions. Coming up with a scenario where the risk in this kind of research is high is hard to do, but I do agree that it's possible, especially when you're dealing with sensitive information around illegal activity or illicit activity. I think related to that, the more information, the better, right? So under what conditions is the person disclosing this? Are you the one arriving at these sensitive issues? Like I've read of studies where researchers have created algorithms that can accurately predict or measure things like sexuality, um, political leaning, gender, things like that. So in those cases, what you create in your research is what causes the risk or incurs the risk, right? And then where is the data going to be? What is the risk that it could be leaked, hacked, inappropriately disclosed? Those are important. And that changes daily with how secure anything in data could really be. And then what is the expectation of privacy on the part of the person disclosing? That's an important factor as well. And to me, that's really an area of debate, because minimal risk is defined as that incurred in daily life, right? Well, everybody in daily life now incurs the risk of breach of privacy. Does that enter into the conversation about what really is minimal risk? Yeah, I don't mean to raise more issues than we're trying to settle, but I guess the more information, the better. What is the real risk? How can you describe it? What is the nature of the data and who's creating it or sharing it or disclosing it? Yeah, it'd be easier to comment on that with a real example, but that's the best I can come up with.
No, that's really helpful. And I think also tees up what an earlier commenter was raising about the kind of the state of legal protections or not around data and data privacy. If you are in a country such as the United States where there's not a general federal privacy law, perhaps there is more general minimal risk that everyone faces because there is not a set of rules and laws in place around collection and use or securing and storing of data. There are obviously some laws in the United States, but it's a stark contrast to something like the European Union, GDPR, where we're seeing much broader sets of protections for data put in place, and maybe changing that evaluation of what is the standard risk that people are exposed to, what is the sort of expectation of risk that people are exposed to. So I think it sounds like a very dynamic environment to be trying to do that risk assessment in as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's also important to know what they've already agreed to. Like in many cases, they've already agreed to a privacy policy or terms of use where they've already agreed to share the data they're disclosing, right? So that should be part of the discussion as well. I mean, what did they agree to when they used the platform?
Right. And then bring in the research from privacy scholars around how meaningful was any agreement at that time. And I think that is where, as we're thinking about this from the research ethics standpoint, I think that is actually a kind of question that we come back to quite a lot, that there's both the legality of what any one platform user or researcher is doing involved in a situation where pervasive data is created and collected and used. But then there's also the underlying ethical concerns, and that those current legal systems may not fully serve or meet the ethical considerations or questions. And so is there room for researchers to find ways to do better than the consent that might be legally sufficient for the purposes of operating an online service? Do researchers want and need to hold themselves to a higher standard? Does the research community have a different orientation towards users as research subjects than perhaps online services do towards users as users and customers of their platform? And then
agree.
conversely, I think we also hear a lot about platforms raising concerns about the legal obligations they do have to their users, especially in places with strong data protection legislation that might be kind of interfering with their ability to be as free as researchers might like them to be with the data that they hand over for the purpose of research.
Yeah, I
Did
agree. There's a wide difference between what's legal and what's ethical. But thank you for your comments.
Yeah, thank you. And Mark, we could go to the next slide, which is also about this question of risks, the very, very open-ended question, but we would really love to hear from folks on the line about what are, we've talked a lot about notice and consent so far, and teed up some of these ideas of what risks may actually be created by research for the people whose data is being used in that research. But would love to hear, again, other examples, situations you've encountered in your research or you've seen colleagues encounter in their research. What should we be on the lookout for? What are the most serious or less serious risks that you have identified with doing research on something as broad as pervasive data? Yes, Anya.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think this is always a hard thing about asking privacy questions in general, is everybody always says, what's the harm? And I think that a loss of privacy and a loss of autonomy is a harm in and of itself, even if there's not a harm that stems from that. I think another type of risk that is not common in how we think about current studies, but I think should be, is group harms and group risks. So there's been some talk about, classifying people or inferring protected status, or inferring sensitive information. And if things are in the aggregate, then there might not be a risk to any individual person, but there still could be some group harms that stem from that. That's not necessarily a response specific to pervasive data, and may just be a more global comment about our research ethics systems. But I think it's a chance to think about this here if you're raising the ethics bar.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen in our research people raising exactly those questions. It reminds me of something Robert was also mentioning. I think it was Robert about is it the researcher who is inferring characteristics or qualities of research subjects, and does that create a risk? Is it a researcher using the inferred labels that an online service provider has created about a group or individual? A lot of folks do research using advertising data, and advertising profiles can be really rich sources of information about how the advertising system predicts different characteristics or qualities about users. So there's multiple layers there of ethical question about both the prediction, the inference about individuals, and then later using that inference for research. Jessica, let me enable your mic. There you go.
So I think too, this isn't a current risk, but a potential future risk, is that even though we think we've de-identified or anonymized, that as we build more sophisticated technology, right, we're able to unmask and actually follow trace routes and actually go back and like identify and make some things are re-identifiable. We saw that with images and videos, right? Like 8-10 years ago. So I think that like we have our hands full thinking about what are the current risks, like as the previous speaker mentioned, but also, if I'm scraping data that a 14-year-old posted, they're still legal to have an account here in the US. Like, can I re-identify them in the future? And, I do a lot of work with mental health and kind of sensitive subjects and content online. So I kind of swim in these uncharted waters quite a bit. But I'm thinking like recently about just like how do you identify, even if I do the best for my health data perspective or personally identifiable perspective, is that are they truly, am I really holding up my end and doing my best because I don't know what's ahead of us from a technological capability.
And I'm curious, related to that risk of re-identifiability, I'm curious how that either Jessica for you or anyone else on the line, how that intersects also with the ongoing conversations about the need for reproducibility in research, right? And there, obviously in certain contexts, there's a lot of call for data sets to be public or to be shareable or shared with different researchers, or at the very least, the ability for a different researcher to go pull the same data set from the same source of pervasive data. And many different complications come into play there, including whether and how that data set may have changed in the online service providers, side of things as months go by, users delete accounts, content comes down, whatever it might be. But also that whole question of what is the ethical obligation to kind of maintain some of those protections for user identity when we may also want to enable other researchers to reproduce or conduct very similar research or use same data sets. That's just kind of a passing question of mine, but would love to hear anyone's thoughts on that or anything else.
So I think that's a really great question, and that's especially important from those of us in the social online space now that a lot of these platforms have deactivated their APIs, so we no longer can easily pull data. We're either having to hand curate data or we are breaking terms of service by, kind of creating, tools to capture that data in ways that platforms don't want us doing. So, I think that's, and some of these platforms just no longer exist. So like if the data sets for these exist, I did some work on a platform that went away, and then all of a sudden, like 4 or 5 years later, it was rebooted, rebranded, brought back, and like what are the implications of technology, just like the churn of the technology companies and the persistence. Like when people have asked me for my data set, especially around, like young adults and eating disorders and mental health issues, we just canonically said we're not sharing this data because these platforms no longer have APIs. We can blame it, right, on things. So it's not really like the data, you couldn't go out and get that data again, but like, also a lot of these data are snapshots in time. So there's not a lot of, you could have people doing different experiments on the same data set, but you're never going to be able to like go and grab new data and it be the same anyway because of the kind of temporality. But yeah, you pointed really great questions.
Yes, Carrie.
So there's one aspect of the data privacy. I know we talk about data privacy from the sense of like the actual data points, but there's also privacy invasive aspect of that. The one example that I have is, Amazon making their warehouse workers wear badges with beacons in them so they knew where their workers were, and then the beacons would follow them into the bathroom. So that's data privacy, yes, but it's also privacy invasive. So now we've got data on someone, kind of in a bathroom. So that's just a random aspect. My biggest issue with this type of pervasive data is the accuracy that we assume is there. When you get into algorithmic systems inferring information on personality traits and social behaviors and these slippery slopes, those kinds of things that if I look at another human, I'm going to be 50-50 at really guessing whether or not that's accurate. An algorithm doing it is, I don't know. And then they're going to label it the way they want. So when we start thinking we can rely on that stuff, I think we better be careful. I know that LinkedIn right now, I pulled my data the other day, they think I'm a man. I'm not. But the inferred data says that I am, and all the inferred skills on there, many of them were wrong. So that inference stuff is a real problem and a real risk to the accuracy of any research that we're relying on with that.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a really important point because it's both that sort of data quality for your research point, but also if there's any reliance on those kinds of inferences in your strategies for protecting users or for, identifying users who might be in a more sensitive situation and need certain additional protections or certain additional kind of confidentiality guarantees or whatever it might be, it's a proxy, and it might be a proxy that gets you some large percentage of who you're trying to target, but could really fall short or over include people into a particular group in a way that needs to be sort of the risks of that and relying on that kind of inference also need to be worked out. Yeah, it's a great point. Any other thoughts that folks wanted to share? Mark, we could go to our next slide. This came up a bit already in conversations with Jessica and Carrie now, but we are very interested in understanding how researchers and platforms and users are thinking about these issues of future proofing, and how do we think about future technological advances around research with pervasive data. So Jessica was already raising the issue of, it's hard enough to think about how to protect confidentiality, how to protect security of data, I think has also come up given the current environment. But we know as technology continues to develop, whether it's data security standards becoming weaker and we all move to quantum computing or whatever it might be, would love to hear folks' thoughts on how do you think about future proofing for ethical considerations given the rapid pace of technology in your own work, or what are things that you think we should have on our radar or that we should really be looking at as we work on this topic? Yes, Robert, go ahead.
I know AI seems to be the big demon around anymore, but you can't help but impose that on where things are going, and particularly the thing that we keep running into and trying to measure risk when AI is involved is the lack of transparency in the algorithms. How do they determine the outcome when you can't query it? So, in this type of research, I know, well, I really can't answer for that. I'm not sure how many of the researchers are employing AI in this kind of research, but an effort toward transparency would really help.
Yes, yeah, that is a great point, and it'd be interesting to hear from folks about some of these questions, whether and how you are using AI in your research. I can think of any number of ways that people might incorporate, whether it's using AI for analysis of data, using chatbot interfaces as ways to conduct experiments or interact with research subjects. AI can mean a lot of different things, and there could be a number of ways it comes up in research. I'm curious if anyone has methodologies or uses of AI that you'd like to share or raise. Or again, any other thoughts or any other comments? We will be coming up on the end of the session in a little bit, and want to make sure we're so glad that so many of you were able to join us for the conversation today, and want to make sure that we're hearing whatever it was that you came to say today. Yes, Carrie.
I would love to hear from some other people. I do a lot of qualitative analysis. There's one particular tool that I'm not going to name because of what I'm about to say. Um, so when you get a large data set in a qualitative scenario, one of the things that I will find myself doing is sentiment analysis. And the tool that I've been using introduced an AI aspect that will help you with your sentiment analysis on these large data sets. And so I ran it. And of course, every time I run it, it's about 50% accurate. So what I know, because I'm an AI risk manager, is that that is about an average score, no matter where you're at, whenever you're doing sentiment analysis. So as you go out and collect data that is supposedly sentiment analysis data, it too is likely only about half accurate. So we have to be mindful of I think these systems will get better, but I don't know how quickly they will get better at doing that kind of stuff, which is, that's a core kind of thing we do in research, is sentiment analysis. So
Yeah, it's a great point. And this conversation about kind of transparency in AI and understanding the capabilities and the performance of different AI tools also reminds me of other work that NTIA and entities like NIST are doing around benchmarking and how do you actually measure and evaluate things like AI safety, but all of the different capabilities that different machine learning tools and AI tools are designed to perform. How do you actually evaluate how well they are doing that, what they are doing, what is actually being measured or generated or evaluated with these tools? And that seems incredibly crucial for also the quality of research that people can conduct using these tools or using information generated by them. I think for policymakers, it all goes back to really wanting reliable, thoughtful inputs to policymaking. We depend on research to have better ideas about what policy can be and should be, and how we should think about these technologies in society. So understanding where all of these questions about validity of evaluations and accuracy of data sets and the impacts that has on research in general is incredibly helpful. All right, any other comments? Anyone else like to come off mute and share your thoughts? Yes, Robert.
Yeah, just an extension of that comment about AI and its current use. I know one of the challenges we face is, for example, using chatbots for screening research subjects or for managing them. One of the big questions is, can you measure how valid or accurate it is, particularly how big is the risk of hallucination? So I think in the development of these technologies, there should be a way to also measure its validity so that when you propose research using them, you can, as was earlier mentioned, just how valid are the data you're collecting or the results you're seeing, that kind of thing. So the technology is great, but what is the level of reliability or validity with each of the tools?
And I'd love if anyone else has thoughts they'd like to share about the overarching topic for this RFC, which is the utility of having ethical guidelines that researchers could use, that everyone from online services to funding sources to users themselves could refer to or understand, as far as setting out some guidelines, some baselines for what ethical research in this field using pervasive data really looks like. it is something of an open question of whether a set of guidelines like these would be useful. So we really hope to hear from folks. Again, we have some time on this call, but we also really hope to hear from you all in written comments in our request for comment, and would love to hear if anyone else has any points or things they'd like to share today. The floor is open. Alrighty, well, if there's nothing else anyone would like to say here on this call today, we just want to thank you very, very much for your participation. A special thanks to everyone who chimed in and shared their thoughts and perspectives. We really, really appreciate it. And I hope it was a very interesting conversation for everyone else on the line. We do have the open request for comment. You can go to this link at regulations.gov. Comments are due January 15th. We know that is a pretty short deadline. We're sorry for the shortness of the deadline, especially around the holidays, but we would love to hear from you by January 15th. The request for comment is fairly lengthy, but we also want to emphasize that you are by no means obligated to answer every single question. Technically, you don't actually have to answer any of the questions, although it's much easier for our own data collection and processing if you do at least let us know which questions you're kind of hinting at when you provide responses. But we're really eager to hear any thoughts that you all have on these different ethical questions, the different topics that we raised on the call today, but everything else that's covered in the RFC. It is truly the product of a significant interagency engagement across the federal government. And so you'll see all sorts of questions, all sorts of angles on this topic in there. And I can assure you there are many across different federal agencies and departments who are really eager to hear from you all and to make sure that your thoughts, your experience, and your expertise is incorporated into whatever we are able to do next on this topic. So thank you all very much. And we will wrap up the call now, but we strongly encourage you to respond in writing to the request for comments. And of course, you can reach out to any of us. My contact information is in the RFC, or you can email data@ntia.gov, and we would be very happy to also hear from you that way. So thank you all very much for your insights today and for spending the time with us. And we look forward to more on this topic very soon.